magician tries to get Dahmer to engage in a life of dreams and unrealities. And in this particular dream, the magician causes him to engage in a dalliance. And Dahmer awakens from the dream, realizing something's not wrong. And here's what Lewis writes, as Dahmer is reflecting. There I was, nearly wrecked, but mark the rest. This woman who came to him in his dreams with her sexual favors, she went too fast. Soft to my arms she came. The robe slipped from her shoulder. The smooth breast was against my own. She shone like flame before me in the dusk, all love, all shame. Bah! It was myself. But all was well, for at the least that moment snapped the spell. In other words, he came to the realization that this woman in his dreams was just a projection of his fantasies, and it was leading him into unreality, and he wakes up at that moment. These are real human beings that we engage with in the lusts of the flesh, and we hurt them. And in the consequence, we lose our own humanity in the process. Matter of fact, Dahmer starts to leave the magician's house, and the magician wants everybody to live by these dreams of self-referentialism, self-centeredness. And so when Dahmer leaves, the magician shoots him, because the magician doesn't want Dahmer to break free of the projection on reality that the magician himself has. What's the antidote to lust? Basically, it's reality. People, not projections, is one of the antidotes. To see another person as he or she really is. And that's why Screwtape again says, separate his sexuality from all that might humanize it. Separate it from reality. Separate it from virtue as a means to pleasure. And lead them towards vice and unrestrained expression that doesn't take into account the humanity of another person. In letter 13, Screwtape warns Wormwood not to allow his patient to experience real pleasure. The characteristic of pains and pleasures, he writes, is that they are unmistakably real, and therefore, as far as they go, give the man who feels them a touchstone of reality. He writes, how can you have failed to see that a real pleasure was the last thing you ought to have him meet? Because a real pleasure would see things as they are, not as he would have them be. In an experiment in criticism, Lewis said, in coming to understand anything, we must accept the facts as they are, not as they are for us. And then we see here mentioned, what I mentioned in our first lecture, Wordsworth's transforming imagination, its projection. In letter 17, this is where he talked about the gluttony of delicacy, and we talked about that under pride. But Lewis finishes his discussion of the gluttony of delicacy by talking about this woman who wants all I want state of mind. I want it like this. I want it like that. She has in her mind what she wants. He says at the end of that particular statement, she doesn't mind what she eats herself, but does like to have things nice for her boy. In fact, of course, her greed has been one of the chief sources of the boy's domestic discomfort for many years. She thinks she's doing right by the boy, but she's projecting on the boy what she wants the boy to be like, rather than being concerned to let the boy be what he ought to be. This woman shows up often in the corpus of Lewis's work. And again, self-referential and so on. I want to read you about her in The Four Loves. There's a wonderful passage about this woman. She's known as Mrs. Fidget. And it may take me a second here to find her. Lewis writes on affection, which is, in this case, mother love gone wrong, because it will not allow the child to be what the mother wants the child to be. It wants the child to be a projection. It won't allow the child to be what the child should be. Mother nurturing the child to fullness of life, but instead the mother projecting on the child. I'll give you a quick story of the worst case I ever saw this. Many years ago, I was a college pastor out in California in the 1970s, and I had this young man in my college group, and he was, something was wrong with him. Our kids loved on him. They made sure he was included in everything. He didn't have a driver's license. He was 19, 20 years old. And one day his social worker called me and said, I've been working with Ricky and his family for many years, and we've never seen him make such progress as he's made since he's come to your college group. And I knew it was because our kids loved on him. He was difficult. He was an odd guy. And she said, I said, well, our kids love on him. They make sure he's included and so on. And I said, is he developmentally disabled? Is there a mental problem with him? She says, oh, no, he's very, very bright. He's just socially disabled. He was the last child of a dysfunctional marriage. The father was a workaholic and the mother felt abandoned. So what she did was she made her son basically her doll. And the social worker said she wouldn't even let him dress himself and comb his own hair till he was 18 years old. And she destroyed her son. It's horrible. But again, it was her needs as the triumphal issue and not concerned about the welfare of the son. It's not sexual lasciviousness, but it is still the destruction of another person for one's own personal interest. Here she is. She appears many places in Lewis's writings. You'll find her as one of the ghosts in The Great Divorce and so on. But this is probably the best short, poignant expression of her. I am thinking of Mrs. Fidget, who died a few months ago. It is really astonishing how her family have brightened up. The drawn look is gone from her husband's face. He begins to be able to laugh. The younger boy, whom I had always thought an embittered, peevish little creature, turns out to be quite human. The elder, who was hardly ever at home except when he was in bed, is nearly always there now and has begun to reorganize the garden. And the daughter, who was always supposed to be delicate, though I never found out exactly what the trouble was, now has the riding lessons which were once out of the question, dances all night, and plays any amount of tennis. Even the dog, who was never allowed out except on the lead, is now a well-known member of the Lamppost Club in their road. Mrs. Fidget very often said that she lived for her family, and it was not untrue. Everyone in the neighborhood knew it. She lives for her family, they said. What a wife and mother. She did all the washing, true. She did it badly, and they could have afforded to send it out to a laundry, and they frequently begged her not to do it, but she did. There was always a hot lunch for anyone who was at home, and always a hot meal at night, even in midsummer. They implored her not to provide this. They protested almost with tears in their eyes, and with truth, that they liked cold meals. It made no difference. She was living for her family. She always set up to welcome you home if you were out late at night. 2 or 3 in the morning, it made no odds. You would always find the frail, pale, weary face awaiting you like a silent accusation. Which meant, of course, that you couldn't with any decency go out very often. She was always making things too, being in her own estimation, I'm no judge myself, an excellent amateur dressmaker and great knitter. And of course, unless you were a heartless brute, you had to wear the things. The vicar tells me that since her death, the contributions of that family alone to sales of work outweigh those of all of his other parishioners put together. And then her care for their health. She bore the whole burden of that daughter's delicacy alone. The doctor, an old friend, and it was not being done on national health, was never allowed to discuss matters with his patient. After the briefest examination of her, he was taken into another room by the mother. The girl was to have no worries, no responsibility for her own health, only loving care, caresses, special foods, horrible tonic wines, and breakfast in bed. For Mrs. Fidget, as she so often said, would work her fingers to the bone for her family. They couldn't stop her, nor could they, being decent people, quite sit still and watch her do it. They had to help. Indeed, they were always having to help. That is, they did things for her to help her to do things for them which they didn't want done. As for the dear dog, it was to her, she said, just like one of the children. It was, in fact, as like one of them as she could make it, but since it had no scruples, it got on rather better than they, and though vetted, dieted, and guarded within an inch of its life, contrived sometimes to reach the dustbin or the dog next door. The vicar says Mrs. Fidget is now at rest. Let us hope she is. What's quite certain is that her family are. Now, don't think Lewis is picking on women. If you want to read the same kind of expose on a man, read the essay, The Sermon in the Lunch in God in the Dock, where Lewis finds a man who is abusive towards his family in this same sort of way, self-referential, utilitarian. In letter 20, we see that Screwtape says this to Wormwood. The goal, he says, is to produce in every age a general misdirection of what may be called sexual taste. Here, sexual taste is the abuse of another person for my own ends, but it's abuse of another person in a particular way. With Mrs. Fidget and with the pastor in the Sermon on the Lunch, it's in a more generalized way. To produce in every age a general misdirection of what may be called sexual tastes. This they do by working through the small circle of popular artists, dressmakers, actresses, and advertisers who determine the fashionable type. As a result, we are more and more, Screwtape writes, directing the desires of men to something which does not exist, making the role of the eye in sexuality more and more important, at the same time making its demands more and more impossible. Again, I've already mentioned the use of undulation as a seedbed for temptation. That's in letter number 8. But again, Lewis advises Wormwood to exploit trough times. In letter 25, we see this. There's the horror of the same old thing. The lust then for novelty. You can't get a person to be satisfied in their present state. They have to lust for something that's beyond what's in their own pasture or their own world. God, who is immutable, created the mutability of time. He even entered it himself. He gives to his creatures a love of permanence as well as a love of change or variety. God seeks to gratify both of these loves via the rhythms of life. To overindulge one side of the permanence variety struggle is to neglect the other. To play to eternity while failing at temporal responsibilities is Gnostic. So too, to play to time while failing at eternal responsibilities is damnable. The antidote to the excesses of change is permanence. The antidote to the excesses of permanence is to discover delight in the particular. Screwtape seeks to exaggerate the pleasures of either, to make an end of it. He seeks to destroy balance and the struggle that brings about balance, and this results in diminished pleasure and increased desire. So the pleasure of novelty is subject to the law of diminishing returns. And this leads to susceptibility to fashion or vogues, and so on. Now, Screwtape's goal basically is to produce that nonsense in the intellect which reinforces corruption in the will. I want to see if I can play this out a little bit. I had a student come to me, this was probably about 14 years ago now. He was one of my advisees. I didn't have him in a class that semester. He knocks on the door. I didn't have office hours, but I opened the door, and there he is, standing there. He looked horribly disheveled. I said to him, "You don't look very good." He said, "I'm not very good. I'm not well at all. I'm seeing a psychiatrist. I'm on antidepressants. I'm seeing a psychologist. I wanted to come by and talk with you." I said, "What is it? Sit down." He said, "It's lust." He said, "It's consuming me. It's destroying me. I don't have any moment, waking moment, where I'm not focused and fixated on this." I knew the student fairly well, and I had never seen any predatory expression on his part. So I said to him, "Describe for me this lust." What he described for me is what I would call normative sexual desire for a horny 20-year-old college guy. I said, "You describe for me sexual desire, not lust." Sexual desire, I said, isn't lust any more than hunger is gluttony. Sexual desire is predatory. The word epithumia in the Greek, it's translated lust, it's used positively in the Bible as well. In Philippians chapter 1, when Paul says to live as Christ, to die as gain, he says, "I desire to depart and be with Christ." And the word he uses there is epithumia, lust. I am predatory about finishing well this life that I'm walking in Christ. I already mentioned the lust of deceit. It's the same word, epithumia, in Ephesians chapter 4. Lust is predatory. Lust seeks to entrap. I said to this young man, "Where did you get the idea that to be normal was wrong?"
Okay. Hang on, everybody.